Hello everyone, this is Evan Abrams, and in this series, looking at audio in motion design, we're going to talk about some very specific workflow things. Basically, there are two main approaches when we have to deal with audio. We can either do the animation first and then layer on the audio afterwards, mixing things in, or we can start with audio and do things in a very audio-driven way. We usually have to do this when there's something that we can't change with the audio. So if you're doing a lyric video, for example, that song cannot change. The visuals have to be driven by what we're hearing. Or maybe we're doing an explainer video where you have a voiceover and that voiceover has to be the way it is. We have to deal with this audio and animate along with it. And of course, sometimes there's a bit of a hybrid workflow required, but in this, we're just going to talk about going the one way, starting with audio that is more or less locked and then learning to animate with it. We're going to look at some techniques and some strategies for dealing with and managing the audio in this way, and hopefully it gets you more confident animating along to sounds. I know that audio is often an afterthought, but hopefully this will make it a forethought. And of course, I need to thank the sponsor of this series, who also provides all of the sounds that you are hearing in the video. It's Soundstripe. Soundstripe is a subscription service with millions of high-quality, curated, royalty-free tracks available with perpetual license. Premium members also get to enjoy sound effects and stems to layer in more nuances to their mixes. Hundreds of new tracks are added every month, and their massive library is easy to search and filter to find exactly what you need to create exceptional content. Use the link in the description to start your free trial of Soundstripe today. When are you going to run into a case where the audio should or must come first, when it cannot be changed? The most obvious of those would be like a lyric video, and that's music and lyrics that cannot be changed, because that's the thing we have to animate to. But we also find this in explainer videos. Those are very audio driven. The voiceover is the primary content, and then the visuals are often asked to conform to that script. And then finally, we might have more abstract pieces that, in order to have a rhythm or pace, we would want to use audio as the driver to simply lock down that element and use it as a guide so our piece will have good flow. These are all on a sliding scale, with being the most immutable or locked on one end, and then the most malleable or plastic on the other end. And your project may fall somewhere in between. But a common factor here today is that we're talking about what to do when the audio has to come first in some way. Let's say, for example, we're doing an explainer video, and we get this lovely script, and under ideal circumstances, we've worked out an AV script, so our visual concepts have been aligned from an early phase with what audio we're going to hear. And in a less ideal situation, maybe it's all locked down, and then we just have to figure out the visuals later. And sometimes you might even need to lay down a scratch track while the proper voiceover gets sorted out. But no matter what, at a certain point, you're going to have some audio, and then we'll have to construct the visuals around the timing of this audio. But in this case, some of it can be pushed around. So our first step should be to make big moves and try to chunk this stuff. Break down what can be broken and lump together what cannot be separated. A lot of this process should happen in the pre-visualization phase. So we're talking about animatics, textomatics. So these we can do in somewhere like Premiere. So here we have the audio down on a sequence, and we've imported some storyboards that we've drawn up based on an AV script, and we brought those into the timeline. In this example here, which is the lovely bit that you just watched at the beginning, we can break down the audio by paragraph or by line, and then we can start to shift the gaps as needed. In areas where we want to do a large change in subject matter or emotional tone, we should leave more space because that animation will likely take longer, or you want to start making choices around where hard cuts are going to go. But a lot of this just comes down to editing and flow. And at this phase, you can consider critically what can move, what can't move, what needs to be tightened, what needs to be loosened. In a place like Premiere, it's easy to cut, shift, and move elements around to see what can flex and what can't to make this as cohesive as possible. Sometimes in this process, you're going to find that visuals don't cover the audio well enough with visual interest. And that's when you need to start thinking about different concepts that are going to play better over longer stretches. Once you're happy with those big choices, you can literally copy and paste this situation into After Effects, or you can just simply right-click on it all and say replace with After Effects composition, and then we can have all of those choices, but then it's going to be in an After Effects composition if that's where you'll be doing the work. Really, you could render this out and use it as reference in whatever app you're going to be using to build those scenes. I'm an After Effects kind of person, so let's talk about what we would do on an After Effects timeline. This is where it's good to pre-compose these elements into comps for scenes that can be compartmentalized. So that might mean one scene for these blocks, then one scene for these blocks. If you have complex transitions between these blocks, maybe they need to live together in one comp. But most often transitions will bridge from one comp to another. So having these scenes locked and in distinct chunks will help make that way more manageable. As you make scenes, you'll likely want to be bringing the split duplicates of the audio into the comps. So then you have only the audio for that scene hanging out in there. Having each scene-specific audio in the scene comps will help you work, and keeping the reference track will keep everything in line if you happen to shift things around on accident. Just remember, anytime you render, just make sure that you don't have duplicate audio. Make sure you turn the audio off 4 layers so you're not like doubling up on some scenes, but not others. There could be some troubles. Either way, at a certain point, we've massaged enough, and we have to get to work on making things move with the sounds we have, or there's no massaging to be done at all. In those cases, you want to start by listening and marking. In After Effects, for example, you can use the little asterisk key to place markers both on a layer or, if nothing's selected, just on the comp itself. So if you're listening along and it feels like a good inflection point, tap that little key. In a lyric video, for example, that would be the furthest end of the spectrum where nothing can really be changed about the audio. You would probably want to be tapping for markers in changes from, say, the verse to the chorus, because those are areas where we're going to have to shift visually in some way. You might say, make a layer in After Effects, and then with that selected, tap the key to lay down reminders that things should be happening. It's hard to scrub audio when in most visually focused apps, so these markers really help to give us guideposts for what we want to do and when. The audio does come with its own visual markers. You can just have a look down here at the waveform by twirling into the properties, but it lacks context. Just looking at the waveform, we don't know what's being said, what words, what concepts. So the markers and the waveforms really make that roadmap visually, so you don't have to constantly come back and re-listen 1,000 times. This marking technique is the same thing we want to do when any audio is coming in. If you're doing a piece along with music or a score or anything along the spectrum that is fixed and cannot be changed, these markers are really going to help. You might also consider just placing simple text layers around that will give you guidance later on with what you feel should be happening or little reminders. You might leave this information in the markers. You can just type that into the markers data here. But sometimes it's good to have a visual on screen. So as you listen through and plan out what's going to happen, you can just be setting down text layers and then duplicating or splitting those text layers and moving them around. This is a technique I highly recommend for lyric videos when you are literally going to have the text on the screen. It's best to block out all that text and then come back and do another pass with the really good, cool looking text. But you could also just be putting in like direction for what movements and content need to be on screen. It's kind of like putting notes on a storyboard, and eventually creates what we call a text-o-matic. Now, something else critical, especially in abstract pieces, is going to be marking out the beat. This is pretty easily done by just listening and doing the marking method we talked about before. You know, listening to percussive hits and marking them down, hitting that asterisk key. But I know this can be a bit more taxing and labor intensive. That's why there are some plugins that can make it a lot simpler. If this is something you're doing a lot and you want to alleviate some of those pain points, then you should look into something like Beat Edit by Mammo World that uses artificial intelligence to automatically drop down these kinds of things. But either way, having this framework will make animating to the beat a lot easier. It's really hard to make elements seem to dance to the music when you don't really have a firm understanding of the beats of that music. So I really recommend listening, considering whether things are going to happen on a beat, hold for a beat, where and when those things are actually happening. Unfortunately, some of this, you really just have to listen and feel. Another thing you'll want to look for is an area of change. Music breaks down into patterns and subversions of those patterns. We want to mark these big changes when we're creating something that's driven by music. A really simple way to do that is to listen for a change and then do something simple like dropping in a solid. Then when one of these big sweeping changes happens, you put in a new color of solid. Now we can see the changes and we know something should visually be changing here. But this is where we can run into conflicts. Say you're making an abstract piece and you've determined that it needs kind of 4 big beats, 4 main scenes or shots, but your audio has 5 large changes to it. That means it's not really a great fit, or you might need to lump some of those together. Those 2 numbers aren't even divisible by each other. We're making a lot of these editing choices before we start doing any of the detail work. That's maybe the biggest change here in motion design, especially when driven by audio, is that we want to edit before we start building things. And since this is an audio-driven piece, the audio has to inform those cuts and inform those choices. We need to transition here into getting more specific. All this pre-production stuff is out of the way, so what techniques can we actually use to get things aligned when you get into a more granular level? I want to first look at the classic trouble of aligning text appearing on screen with the words that are being said. This is a pretty common issue that people can read words in their head faster than we can ever say them out loud. And when someone can read text and then receives the exact same information but read slower, this is when the audience attention will start to wane. So the idea is text should be appearing occurring sort of as words are being said. On the flip side, there's an old adage that text should remain on screen so that people can read it kind of twice over if the goal is to have this be readable for accessibility. So this means you want to line up your animation of text so that the words resolve and become readable just ahead of the words being said. That way people will read and hear almost simultaneously. This is a hard needle to thread, and if you're using text layers and text animators, this can definitely be tricky. If you want to know about text animators specifically, we got tutorials on the channel about them, but in general, you just want to make sure that you're paying attention to the speed the text is coming on and when it becomes readable as it relates to the words being heard. So that means you might have to move things back a little bit, add a little bit of padding, or even accelerate things and play with the keyframes at a more granular level. Next, I want to talk about impacts. When you want a moment to seem to hit. When something lands on a beat or a percussive sound or maybe a word utterance, we want this kind of impact. That means aligning your keyframes so that motion seems to reach a terminus. If this is something that has like a bounce or wobble, then that first kind of wobble when we're reaching the end state, should happen on the hit, should happen on the beat. And similar to impacts are triggers. If we want a sound to seem like it's actually knocking things into motion. That could be a layer or maybe a camera move or even a cut to another scene. So that may mean that your first keyframe needs to be aligned to these audio spikes, or if you're using anticipation, that first big push should align. And I hope that kind of makes sense. Sometimes it's the first keyframe, but depending on your nuances, it might not be. When you're planning your motion, consider, is the audio describing the motion? Does the motion seem to motivate the sound? What cause and effect relationships does this imply or suggest? Well, hopefully this has given you somewhere to start in your animations when you're doing very audio-driven pieces. However, our work does not stop here. Sometimes we need to come back and layer on more audio afterwards, or there's really no audio to start with. So in the next video, we are going to look at layering audio on top of already completed animation. And don't worry, I know that most motion design applications are not where we want to do this work. So we're going to be opening up Adobe Audition. If you're already a Creative Cloud member, you can just go ahead and install that. And if you've never opened it before, don't worry, we're going to be taking it very easy, one step at a time. I know people rarely open up Audition, so don't worry, we're going to go easy. Now, a big thank you to Soundstripe for sponsoring this video and this entire series and providing all of the audio that you hear as we're working here. If you want to follow along and use all the sounds you're hearing, then please use the link in the description and start your free trial of Soundstripe today. But of course, thanks most of all to you for watching this and hanging out with me here on the EC Abrams tutorial channel. If you like learning this kind of thing, if you want to see more of this series, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so that you get this stuff in your inbox when it comes out. That's it for me. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you around the internet.